Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at variable scope. Let's get started. Today we have three learning objectives. The first one is that when we're done, we should be able to explain what is meant by the scope of a variable. We should also be able to distinguish between two types of scopes, local and instance. And finally, we should be able to examine code and identify which variables are in scope at any point. Before we go any further, we should probably discuss what the word scope actually means. And basically, scope is a way of describing where a variable that we put in our code does and does not exist. A good rule of thumb for scope is that variables typically only exist within the block they were created. So if you create a variable inside a method, it's only usable inside of that method. If you create a variable in a class, it's only usable inside of that class. Basically, a really loose way to describe it is you can only use a variable inside of the curly brackets where that variable is defined. To see what I mean by that, let's take a look at an example. In this code, and it doesn't really matter what the code does, I want you to notice that there are two variables that have been created. The first one is this x variable, and this is created inside of the main method. And then I also have this while loop, and within the while loop, I've created a new variable y. And so the question then is, what is the scope of these variables? Where do they exist and where don't they exist? Now, following our rule that a variable exists in the block where it was defined, we can assume that x exists in the shaded block that you see. I declare x at the top of the method, and so x can be used anywhere within that method, but x will not exist anywhere outside of this method. Likewise, with the y variable, that's declared inside of the loop. So that y variable can be used inside of that loop, but as far as Java is concerned, outside of the loop, that y variable doesn't exist. And if you try to use y outside of the loop, Java will get confused and throw an error. Let's take a look at another example, but this time let's take a look at an entire class that has both an instance variable and a couple of methods. And so we want to get a handle on what the scope of all the variables here are. So let's start with the instance variable at the top. So an instance variable is usable anywhere inside the class. It doesn't matter if it's private. Private only applies to the outside world. So in a sense, you can think of an instance variable as global. Anything in the class can use it and refer to it. Now, other variables exist as well in this class, including num and result. And you'll notice that num and result are both variables inside of this method. Num happens to be a parameter, and result is just a variable that I create in the body of the method. And so num and result are usable, but only in this method. Notice that they're not usable anywhere else in the class or in the other method. The same goes for method 2, where you can see I declare a variable I. I only exists within that block of code, within that method that it's declared. In fact, more specifically, I is only usable in that loop because it is indeed the loop variable. Now, when you look at the class as a whole, we have the instance variable at the top, but all the other variables are defined within methods. And so these variables that are defined within methods, whether they're a parameter or not, they're in the method, and these are called local variables. And local variables are created in the method, but when the method is finished executing, they're completely destroyed. So only the instance variables are going to continue to exist. Okay, and this is called local scope. Variables that are created in a method only exist in the method. And again, this is consistent with what we said before. When we make a variable in a block of code, it's only usable in that block of code, whether the block is a class or the block is a method or the block is a loop. Now, sometimes there can be an apparent conflict between scope of variables, and I want you to see what I mean. In this example, I have an instance variable called value, and then I have a local variable inside the method called value. And down here in this line int result, I try to do value plus 5. But the question is, when I do value plus 5, which value am I referring to? Am I referring to the local value, or am I referring to the instance value? And so Java has to make this decision when it sees the word value. And this, what you see happening here, is called shadowing. And shadowing happens when there's a local variable and an instance variable of the same name. So we already know that the instance variable exists throughout the class. So we know that our instance value exists everywhere, including in the method. We also know that the local value exists within its method, but of course there's the overlap, right? So value, which when we talk about value in the method, are we talking about the local one or are we talking about the instance one? And what happens is by default, when shadowing occurs, Java defaults to the local scope. So as far as Java is concerned, when we say value, we're talking about the most local value possible. And Java doesn't even consider the fact that there's a class level one. So shadowing, again, means that we have an instance variable and a local variable of the same name. And Java is going to default to the local, not the instance. Even though Java defaults to local scope when shadowing occurs, we can tell Java to look at the class level or instance variable using the this reference. And we've seen it in at least one example before. And so you might remember that the this reference can distinguish between scopes when shadowing occurs. And so by saying this.value, I'm telling Java to look at the instance variable, where on the previous slide, when I just said value, Java just defaults to the most local scope. Let's see if this is making any sense with an understanding check. So what I've got is I've got a class on the right. And in this class, there are 4 different variables. Name, which shows up here at the top. N shows up here in the constructor as a parameter. Rand exists also in the constructor. And then I've got the variable I as part of a loop down at the bottom. And in this code, I've also identified 4 different points with a comment. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to identify at each of those points which variables exist or which variables are in scope. In other words, if we stop the code right here at this first comment, which variables exist at this point? And if we stop the code right down here, which variables are in scope exist at this point? Pause the video, and when you're ready, we'll take a look at the answers. So on the right, I filled in the answers to the variables that are in scope, and let's just kind of go through them briefly. You'll notice that in all of the stopping points, name exists because name has class level scope, instance scope, and so that exists throughout the class. Starting at the top, you will also notice that the scope at this point includes n because n is a parameter, but notice that it does not include the rand variable. And that is because at this point in the code, the rand variable has not yet been created, therefore it cannot exist or be in scope. Now, at the end of the method, where our second stopping point is, you'll notice that the rand variable is included because that now exists. But once the method is finished, those local variables n and rand will be destroyed, which is why you notice them not showing up at our other stopping points. So onto the display method, right here in the body of the loop, you will notice that in addition to the instance variable, I also exists because I is a loop variable and we are inside of that loop. However, as soon as we finish that loop, I is no longer in scope because remember, variables are only usable in the block of code where they're defined. So once the loop is done, I is no longer a thing. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to explain what is meant by the scope of a variable. You should also be able to distinguish between local variables and instance variables in terms of their scope. And finally, you should be able to examine code and identify which variables are in scope at any point.